Whenever I do maintenance to my table saw, I always start with vacuuming out the inside, and that begins with taking off the motor housing cover here and the panel on the back by taking off the screws that attach them. I then get inside with a vacuum and suck up all of the dust. It's important to note that even if you have dust collection hooked up to your saw, heavier dust will still fall to the bottom. It won't get sucked through. So from time to time, you will need to go in and manually suck out that dust somehow. After that, since there's no real good way to vacuum the cracks and crevices of the trunnions and the motor and all of the gears, I just shoot some compressed air at it with my vacuum on and try and catch what I can. It is not the most elegant solution, but I have not found any vacuum attachment really suitable for this purpose, so this is really the best I can do. After that, I lube up the gears. It's important to note that you can't use any type of lubricant. You can't just use grease. You can't just use any standard type of gear lube because these gears will attract dust and a lot of it. So you need to go with some dry lube, some dust-resistant lube, and WD-40 sells a product that's perfect for that purpose. This dry lube PTFE spray. PTFE is more commonly known as Teflon. So I take this Teflon spray, and I spray it on the worm gear here and also the crank that lifts the saw up and down. So I make sure to get all that in there very liberally, and then I crank on the saw to work it into the gears. And I do the same thing for the gears on the right, which you can't see, which adjusts the saw angle bevel to up to 45 degrees. Next, I turn my attention to the cast iron top. There are a ton of ways to clean a cast iron top. The way that I've settled on involves mineral spirits, steel wool, a random orbit sander with 2 grits of paper, 400 and 800, some Bow Shield T9, and then some gloves and a lot of paper towels. The first step in the process is to take some mineral spirits and some steel wool and just sort of hit the top and pre-clean all the leftover Bow Shield or paste wax or gunk or grime or seasonal accumulation, pitch, resin, whatever that is on top of your saw, rust, God forbid. This is sort of the first step. This takes the most of the abuse. Very important to note that even though I'm not showing it here, I pay special attention to those miter slots because the steel wool is the only way that I clean out those miter slots. So I get in the miter slots with the steel wool on this step, and then after each successive sanding with my random orbit sander that you'll see me do. Anyway, after that, I wipe off all the crap and put a thin, emphasis on thin, layer of spirits on top of the saw, just enough to coat everything. And then I hit it with my random orbit sander at 400 grit paper. Now, I know some of you are going to be cringing and saying, what are you doing? You're sanding wet surface with the random orbit sander. You're going to fuck it up, blah, blah, blah. I'm not so sure that's true. Random orbit sanders, they encounter moisture a lot. If you're sanding in a humid environment, that humidity is going to be sucked into the vacuum. If you're sanding very green wood, very wet wood, same thing. So I'm taking my chances here. I understand if you don't want to, and I'm almost certain this is not a recommended use for this tool. So another alternative would be to just take a flat reference surface, a flat sharpening stone or a flat something or other, and just wrap a piece of 400 or 800 grit paper around it. It takes more time, but if you're not comfortable using a random orbit sander, then that would be another method. But anyway, I wipe everything off, and then I go through the exact same process with 800 grit paper. The advantage of the orbit sander is that it's faster. The mechanical action, it just does more work for you in quicker time than you could do yourself scrubbing a surface with sandpaper attached to a flat reference. I would not recommend just using sandpaper by hand because it needs to reference off something flat. If you use sandpaper by hand, you could possibly make dips and valleys in your surface, and you don't want that. So I wipe everything off again with mineral spirits after each hit with the orbit sander, and then finally just sort of wipe everything nice and clean and dry before I proceed to my final step, which is applying the Bow Shield. BoShield T9 is a great product. It is used in a lot of high-stakes applications like the aerospace industry and things like that. It's about $20 for that can, which seems expensive, but I do maintenance to my saw maybe 3 times a year, and I love this stuff. I've used paste wax before, and I just wasn't really satisfied with the coverage that I got. So this stuff you spray on very liberally, and you let it sit for a while, and then you wipe it off. I also like to wipe the guide rails and also the sides of the cast iron as well, just to make sure everything really gets hit with this stuff before I let it sit for a while. So the last thing is to clean the blade. You can see the shop foreman there showing me how to crank the blade all the way up before letting me, the lowly apprentice, finish the job. Blade goes all the way up. Red lever on the right side also flips up. And then you use the 2 wrenches that came with the saw to loosen the arbor nut. Just make sure you don't do this.
Careful.
So as the shop foreman said, be careful, because if you drop one of those wrenches into the saw, it is a hassle to get out. Relatedly, if you drop the arbor nut that I'm twisting off right now into the saw, that is also a hassle to get out. Don't ask me how I know that. So I soak the blade in a bath of Simple Green all-purpose cleaner. I've used this stuff for about 3 or 4 years, but I don't think I'm going to use it going forward. The reason is because I stumbled across a video from King's Fine Woodworking, a fantastic YouTube channel, in which James King, in describing what he uses to clean his blades, recommended not using this all-purpose cleaner, because James, who has a chemistry background himself, said that the chemicals in the all-purpose cleaner could cause the glue, the bonding agent that bonds the carbide teeth to the blade, to weaken, which might result in the carbide tooth falling off, or worse, flying at you during operation when you're using the saw, which is very bad. Simple Green sells a product just for saw blades. I might look into that. But in any event, I use some Simple Green and some hot water, and you can see the black pitch and resin comes right off with a nylon brush. I go tooth by tooth all around the blade. I flip the blade over, do the same thing on the other side. I get the fronts of the blade as well. And then because I only use Simple Green for this application, I strain it through and reuse it all. What I didn't show is that I spray the blade with Bostik Blade Coat, which is another dry lubricant, but you could use BoShield for that too. So around this time, I think I've given about an hour for this BoShield to film up. I've not quite found what the optimal wait time for BoShield is. The directions are pretty vague. They say if you want a thicker film, leave it on longer. If you want a thinner film, wipe off quicker. I think it also depends on the amount of time and the weather that you are applying it on. So if you wait for an hour on a warmer day, it might film up quicker than if you wait for an hour on a cold day. So in any event, the job here is not to wipe off all of the BoShield. It's to just sort of get most of it up and leave a very thin layer behind. And that very thin layer will film up and tack up. I usually don't use my saw for the rest of the day after I do this process, just to allow whatever residual BoShield is left to sort of film up. And as you can see, when I'm done with that process, the top is very shiny. It's very smooth, very slick. The fence rides nice and smooth. And I also put this on the router table as well, just so everything is nice and smooth. I very much like this process. If you do it right, you can maintain your saw for many, many years.